People knew it was going to come down because they had been told that by people who were determined to bring it down. No such building has ever come down from office fires before at any time. And yet it turns out there were people that knew within a couple of minutes of when it was going to come down. And they're on record as saying it. Ashley Banfield, one of the major journalists who was on the scene on World Trade 7, she basically points to the building, looks into the camera and said, I've been told that this building is the next one that's going to come down.
That building right there, the brown building, the tall one, is number 7 World Trade Center. I've heard several reports from several different officers now that that is the building that is going to go down next. In fact, one officer told me they're just waiting for that to come down at this point, that there's no way it's going to be recovered and there's no way that they can stabilize it.
CNN anchor Aaron Brown says there's another building at World Trade Center which I've been told is either collapsing or has collapsed.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing. And you, to be honest, can see these pictures a little bit more clearly than I.
While CNN is showing World Trade 7 for about an hour after erroneously reporting its collapse, they have a caption at the bottom of the picture, World Trade 7 on fire, may collapse, which looks so kind of normal and reasonable that I think most viewers would think, okay, well, here's a building, it's on fire, it may collapse, what's the problem? What the viewers haven't been told at that point is that no such building, no such steel-framed skyscraper in history had ever collapsed from fire. So it's not normal at all. World Trade 7 on fire may collapse. It's like saying Graeme MacQueen has a cold, may die. You know, I mean, what do you mean he has a cold, he may die? People, I'm sure, occasionally have died from cold, but they don't normally. And World Trade Center 7 coming down from fire is just unheard of. So that's why I refer to this as normalizing the abnormal, you know, trying to make it look normal and reasonable when in fact it's unprecedented, it's outlandish. I mean, if it's true that World Trade 7 came down from office fire, there are just hundreds and hundreds, I suppose thousands and thousands of buildings in the world that are at risk of total disaster. And we have to be worried, and we have to change the engineering curriculum in universities and the building codes and everything. And of course we haven't, because I think the authorities are perfectly aware that it didn't come down from office fires. The BBC anchor says, you know, we're now going to confirm what we told you a couple of minutes before, namely that the Salomon Brothers building at the World Trade Center, and that's another name for World Trade 7, has indeed collapsed.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing.
And then he says, we'll go to Jane Standley, our reporter at the scene, for more. And there's Jane.
Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Solemnly confirming what he says, and she's standing right in front of World Trade 7, which is clearly not, it hasn't collapsed and it isn't collapsing. When this video was discovered, I think it was 2007, and widely spread on the internet, it was quite a scandal. So the head of the BBC had to eventually reply, and he said, well, if we reported this before it happened, I can assure you it's not because we were part of some conspiracy. It was not because we were told in advance of its collapse that it was going to come down. If this happened, then we can assure you it was simply an error and nothing else. For a whole bunch of reasons, it doesn't work to say this was an error. When we're asking whether Building 7 may have been deliberately brought down on 9/11, whether it might have been subjected to controlled demolition, we get called a lot of names. You know, we're conspiracy theorists and we're overthinking, you know, a simple situation, so on and so forth. But of course, we know that the option of deliberately bringing that building down was discussed on 9/11. It's not like we made this up. There is, for example, an interview with, I believe it's a Lieutenant Restuccio in the Fire Department of New York, this is just after Building 7 comes down, and the journalist says to him, so that was Building 7 that came down, and Stuccio says, yes, indeed it was.
Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day?
We had heard reports that the building was unstable and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down. I would imagine it came down on its own.
Obviously, it had been discussed during the day, the possibility of bringing it down, which is why he can't exclude that option as one possibility. When people are trying to defend the official narrative of World Trade 7's collapse, they generally try to make it sound as if, well, people had a hunch, or they were worried, or they made a rational prediction that it might come down. And I'm saying none of those words, prediction, hunch, and so on, is good enough. What we actually have is foreknowledge. When we use the term foreknowledge, we should be careful. And I include 3 criteria. The first is what you might call a subjective state in the person who's knowing. You have to feel certain. You have to feel a high degree of confidence. So, for example, if you say, well, I'm worried about that building. I have a hunch something bad might happen to it. Well, that's not good enough to use the term foreknowledge. But if you say, oh, it's definitely coming down, that fulfills the criterion of certainty. Second criterion is what I call confirmation. The thing you claim to know has to actually happen. Otherwise, we don't usually use the word knowledge. Even if a person was certain, we would say, well, they had a false belief or they had unjustified confidence. But if I say, I'm confident Building 7 is coming down, and lo and behold, Building 7 does come down, that's confirmation. That means my confidence was justified. And the third criterion is detail. And by that, I just mean that your knowledge of, let's say, when or the conditions under which this event is going to happen has to be fairly precise for us to use the term foreknowledge. Once we've established that there was foreknowledge of World Trade 7's collapse, by that I mean the records are quite good. We know there were a lot of people who were completely confident it was coming down. In fact, we're told there were hundreds of firefighters who were standing around for hours, and the way they put it is, we were waiting for World Trade 7 to come down. In other words, they had been told it was definitely coming down. So we know this. So there was confidence. There was confirmation. The building did come down. And there was precision. We have, again, very good records. We know that it was known within a few minutes when it was going to come down. And that's quite extraordinary because, of course, no steel skyscraper in history had ever come down from fire before. Remember, this building wasn't hit by a plane. So if this is an unprecedented event, it never happened before, and yet people are able to say within a few minutes when it was going to come down, you see what I'm saying? This is fishy, and these 3 criteria, confidence, confirmation, and detail, have been met. Now, once we've established that, we say, well, what are the kinds of foreknowledge that exist? And I make a distinction between 2 broad kinds of foreknowledge. One is evidence-based foreknowledge, and one is action-based foreknowledge. Evidence-based foreknowledge just means, you look around and you gather evidence that something is going to happen, and then you make a prediction. So like a doctor would look at the patient's condition and say, on the basis of that doctor's experience, on the basis of the fact that that disease is well known, and so on and so forth, would say, my prognosis is that this person is going to die within the next 2 months, or even the next week, or even the next day. That's prognosis. So we could call that, if it's confirmed and is given with a lot of detail and confidence, we could call it foreknowledge. And it would be evidence-based, and there's nothing fishy about it. It happens. The second kind of foreknowledge is action-based. And all I mean by that is that the person knows something is going to happen because they're going to act to make it happen. Or alternatively, they're aware of somebody else who's going to act to make it happen. So if I say, I know I'm going to be sitting at my desk at 8:15 tomorrow morning, I know that because I'm going to make a point of acting in such a way that I'm at my desk at 8:15. And that's a different kind of foreknowledge. And there's nothing fishy about that either. It's very common. It's great. It's no problem. But it can be a problem if somebody misrepresents the kind of foreknowledge that's at issue. So if I say that I'm acting on evidence-based foreknowledge when that's impossible, then we have a problem. And to just sum this up, what I'm saying about Building 7 is that the official government investigators are trying to get us to believe that an evidence-based prediction had been made, that there was evidence and there was a rational conclusion that Building 7 might come down, whereas in fact, when we study it carefully, we see that that does not fly. It's impossible. That in fact, we are led to the conclusion that it must have been action-based foreknowledge, or to put it bluntly, people knew it was going to come down because they had been told that by people who were determined to bring it down. So in other words, this foreknowledge, this particular kind of foreknowledge, supports the hypothesis that World Trade 7 was brought down by controlled demolition. NIST, when it came out with its final study on World Trade 7, it said no, it didn't come down because of storage of fuel tanks in the building. It didn't come down because of damage from World Trade 1. It came down from office fires and fires that were presumably caused by the collapse of the other buildings. And they led to a whole string of really unique, peculiar events, this long span girder in this column, and one thing heats up and it pushes another thing off its seat, and that leads to this and that. And this whole strange sequence of events, which was invisible to the eye of anyone looking at the building, it all took place within the structure of the building, took place really at the very last moment, within a few minutes or even a few seconds of the actual initiation of the collapse. So that's the official government explanation of why World Trade 7 came down. There were fires, they led to peculiar, unique events that happened at the last moment. But if that's true, what point is there in talking about what some engineer thought around noon on the day, 5.5 hours before the building came down, or what firefighters might have thought? And to just sum this up, what I'm saying about Building 7 is that the official government investigators are trying to get us to believe that an evidence-based prediction had been made, that there was evidence and there was a rational conclusion that Building 7 might come down, whereas in fact, when we study it carefully, we see that that does not fly. It's impossible. That in fact, we are led to the conclusion that it must have been action-based foreknowledge, or to put it bluntly, people knew it was going to come down because they had been told that by people who were determined to bring it down. So in other words, this foreknowledge, this particular kind of foreknowledge, supports the hypothesis that World Trade 7 was brought down by controlled demolition.